Ladies and gentlemen, what if I told you that hidden beneath the dust of time lies a mystery, a revelation waiting to be uncovered? What if the first words of Moses, the man who stood at the burning bush, who faced Pharaoh, who parted the sea, had been discovered? What would it mean for us today? The first words of any man are significant, but the first words of a prophet, chosen to speak for God, carry eternal weight. They are not merely syllables spoken into air, they are harbingers of destiny. When Moses opened his mouth, it was not just the sound of a man, it was the beginning of a covenant. What if the first words of Moses had truly been uncovered? Imagine the weight of that moment, the unveiling of a voice that carried nations, that shifted empires, that shook the earth itself. For the words of Moses were never just the voice of a man, they were the echo of heaven breaking into time. His first words would not have been random nor insignificant, for in the scriptures the beginning always carries the seed of the whole. The first words of Genesis, in the beginning, hold the key to all creation. The first words of prophets often reveal their mission. And so, if the first words of Moses were to be revealed, they would contain within them the essence of his calling, the destiny of Israel, and the foreshadowing of something far greater yet to come. Moses, the one who once stammered before Pharaoh, became the voice of covenant. Sudi! His speech, though flawed by human weakness, was anointed with divine strength. The discovery of his first words would not be about archaeology alone. It would be about revelation. Ancient words written on scrolls or carved into stone do not merely tell us about the past. They reach into the present, summoning us back to the foundations we have forgotten. They remind us that the covenant God made is not confined to one generation, but stretches across millennia, still speaking with power today. The importance of those words is not only historical, they call us to remember who we are and whose we are. They remind us of the wilderness and the Red Sea, of promises and commands of mercy and judgment. They echo into our time because the voice that spoke through Moses is the same voice that still calls through Scripture. The first words would be more than a message to Israel in the desert. They would be a message to every heart wandering through its own wilderness, searching for light, for direction, for deliverance. When we think of such a discovery, we must realize that its truest meaning is not in the dust of ancient tablets, but in the living power of the Word of God. The words of Moses are not locked in the past. They are alive whenever we open the book of the law, whenever we hear the summons to holiness, justice, and covenant. His first words are discovered every time the voice of God penetrates the silence of our hearts and awakens us to destiny. And yet, even greater than Moses is the word to which he pointed. His first words foreshadow the ultimate word, the one that was from the beginning, the word that became flesh and dwelt among us. So the question is not only whether the first words of Moses have been found in archaeology. The greater question is whether they have been found in us. For the discovery that truly matters is when ancient truth is uncovered in living hearts, when revelation becomes transformation, and when the echo of the first words awakens us to the eternal word. Moses was more than a leader, more than a liberator of Israel. He was the voice through which God's covenant with humanity was revealed. His journey began not with armies or crowns, but with words. Words that carried the weight of eternity, words that bound a people to their Creator, words that revealed the blueprint of divine relationship. To understand Moses is to understand the power of covenant, for his mission was not only to bring Israel out of Egypt, but to bring them into alignment with the God of heaven. That echo would summon us to see our lives as part of a larger story, one that began long before us and one that will continue long after. When we hear the echo of beginnings, we are reminded that we too are called to beginnings of our own. Every turning point in life, every new season, every step into unknown territory carries the sound of a first word. The words of Moses remind us that we must begin with God. Without his voice, beginnings falter. With his voice, they flourish. The echo of Moses' first words would not simply remind us of his journey, but invite us to consider our own. What words are framing the direction of our lives? Are they words of fear, doubt, compromise, or are they words rooted in promise and faith? Ultimately, the echo of the beginning is not meant to remain in the past. It is meant to awaken the present. If Moses' first words were uncovered, they would not simply belong to history, they would belong to today. They would stand as a call to listen again, to return to the source and to align our lives with the voice that first spoke through a stammering shepherd, a voice that still shapes the destiny of nations and the hearts of men. To remember is to return, and every discovery of the past serves as a call to remember what we have forgotten. If the first words of Moses were ever to be revealed, their meaning would extend far beyond archaeology or history. They would stand as a reminder, a call to a people who often drift into forgetfulness, to once again take hold of covenant and holiness. Memory in the biblical sense is not simply recalling facts, but reliving and re-entering the reality of what God has done. To remember is to realign. The people of Israel were constantly called to remember the God who delivered them from Egypt, the covenant given at Sinai, and the words of their prophets. To forget was to fall, but to remember was to stand in blessing. The first words of Moses, therefore, would remind us not only of what was said, but of the weight behind those words. They were not spoken as empty rhetoric, but as covenant words, binding heaven and earth, calling a people into identity and destiny. To hear them again would be to awaken to what has always been true, that we are not our own, that we belong to the one who formed us and redeemed us. It would be a call to return to covenant faithfulness, to step away from compromise, and to recover what has been lost in the noise of modern distractions. In every generation, people drift. They pursue comfort over covenant, self over sacrifice, and in doing so they forget the voice that once called them out of bondage. The rediscovery of Moses' first words would shatter that forgetfulness like a trumpet blast, reminding us that the same God who spoke then is still speaking now. The challenge would not be in hearing those words, but in responding to them. For words remembered but not obeyed are powerless. It is only when they are received and acted upon that they release their full force. Holiness is not an option that can be added on to life. It is the essence of covenant. To be called into covenant is to be called into separation, into living differently, into reflecting the character of the one who called. The first words of Moses would remind us of that separation. They would stand as a mirror, revealing where we have drifted and where we must return. They would not simply tell us who Moses was, but who we are meant to be. Such a discovery would not be about lifting up ancient artifacts, but about lifting up our lives to once again match the call of God. It would remind us that holiness is not antiquated, but eternal, that covenant is not for yesterday, but for every day, and that remembering is the only way to walk forward without losing our way. The first words would summon us to return, to realign, and to live as covenant people once more. The words of God are not bound by the ticking of clocks or the turning of calendars. They operate in what the ancients called Kairos, the appointed time of heaven. If the first words of Moses were to be uncovered, they would not simply mark a moment in the past, they would awaken us to a Kairos moment in the present. Chronos is human time, the ordinary passing of hours and days. But Kairos is divine time, when heaven intersects with earth, when God interrupts history to bring about his purposes. The significance of those first words would not be in when they were first spoken, but in how they still speak now, summoning us to recognize the moment we are living in. Moses himself was called in a Kairos moment. He had lived 40 years in Egypt and 40 years in Midian. Time had passed, but little had changed. Then suddenly the burning bush appeared and everything shifted. It was not random, it was appointed. God does not waste words or moments. The call of Moses reminds us that there are seasons when God compresses eternity into a single moment, when his voice calls us to step into destiny. If his first words were revealed to us, they would not just be a window into his time, they would be a doorway into ours. Kairos moments are never comfortable. They disrupt the ordinary and demand a response. Israel encountered such a moment at the Red Sea when they stood with the waters before them and Pharaoh's army behind them. It was not simply another day in history, it was an appointed time when God revealed his power and shifted their destiny. From that disruption came the call that would change history. So too, every disruption in our lives carries a hidden fire. The first words of Moses would point us to see that what feels like collapse may in fact be the threshold of calling. Destiny cannot be fulfilled without being shaken free from the ordinary. The disruption is the preparation, the breaking is the remaking, and the interruption is the introduction to a greater plan. Those first words, spoken through the life of a man shaped by upheaval, would still declare today that every disruption is a doorway to destiny. There are no accidents in the timing of your birth, the age in which you live, or the circumstances that surround your life. Every generation is chosen to face its appointed season, and every person is placed into history by design. If the first words of Moses were ever to be revealed, they would remind us of this eternal truth. You were born for this turning. Just as Moses was not born by chance into the era of Pharaoh, but precisely into the time when a deliverer was needed, so too each of us carries within us a calling tailored to the season in which we live. Moses' life demonstrates this reality with striking clarity. From the moment he entered the world, his existence was marked by divine intention. Pharaoh's decree sought to destroy him, yet the hand of providence guided him to safety in the waters of the Nile, into the very household of the king, who wished him dead. His survival was no accident. It was preparation. His upbringing in the palace gave him knowledge of leadership, law, and culture, while his years in the wilderness gave him humility and dependence on God. Both were necessary, for his destiny required both the strength of Egypt and the solitude of Midian. In the same way, the details of your own life are not random. The struggles you have endured, the places you have been, the talents you carry, and even the weaknesses you wrestle with are part of a divine design shaping you for purpose. A discovery of Moses' first words would speak into that reality, reminding us that calling does not arrive in spite of our circumstances, but through them. What appears like failure or delay may actually be preparation. What seems insignificant may be the very tool through which destiny unfolds. The turning that Moses was born for was not a private turning, but a national one. His life was intertwined with the destiny of an entire people. When he stepped into his calling, an entire generation was set free. So too, the turning you are born for is not only about you. It is about the lives your obedience will touch, the doors your faith will open, and the impact your courage will leave on those who come after you. To deny that calling is not simply to limit your own life. It is to rob others of the blessing connected to your purpose. To be born for a turning means to be ready when the harbinger appears, to recognize the moment when destiny calls, and to answer with faith rather than fear. The first words of Moses would remind us that we cannot wait for perfect conditions or absolute clarity. The call of God often comes in the midst of uncertainty, when the world seems dark and the way seems blocked. It is then that we are summoned to rise, to step into the turning, and to live out the reason we were placed in this time. You were born not by accident, but for this moment, and this moment is your call to step into destiny.